Tábula Rasa, um bate-papo de vivências a favor do conhecimento contra o etarismo e a serviço de recomeços.
Bem-vindos, bem-vindas, mais uma vez aqui no canal Tábula Rasa Sênior. Hoje nós temos aqui conosco David Saunders, que vai compartilhar conosco como é viver bem como expatriado aposentado após uma vida inteira mudando de países, vivendo em diferentes cenários e circunstâncias, sozinho ou com a família. Então nós hoje vamos ter uma aula mestre com alguém que conhece muito bem viver em diferentes países, culturas e se entrosar com todo esse povo que viveu com ele dentro desses cenários extremamente desafiadores e de extrema aventura. David, muito obrigado, bem-vindo, vamos começar? E a partir de agora vai ter que ler as legendas, porque o nosso entrevistado vai falar tudo em inglês. How to build an expatriate life until the retirement phase. And thank you, David, for your generosity to come and talk for our audience a little bit more about this exciting life and how it's going for you and what you can see, your opinions, your tips, your advices about that very interesting life at this moment in the world. So, David, can you present to our audience?
Sure. My name's David Saunders, as you mentioned. I worked in many different jobs in different countries. I worked in 17 different countries.
17.
Yeah. And probably most interesting with the United Nations for around 20 years. I grew up in the UK. I'm British. My parents dragged me along to church every week. And I was always very keen on history. I got engaged in wargaming, strategy wargaming, as a young kid with models and soldiers, which actually includes a lot of mathematics, strangely. And then I was very keen on swimming and water sports. So that kind of gives you an idea of where I came from. And obviously I realized we'll talk more about jobs later.
Okay, so all those skills and preparation served to prepare for you for a life abroad, United Kingdom. Let's say that.
I wouldn't say it prepared me for a life abroad, but it was one of those things because of my interest in history and general geography in the world. I spent, as a young child, I was always interested in different things going on. And as I grew up, that interest only strengthened. My parents really encouraged us to be very independent and strong and to succeed. I went to university in Leeds, 3.5, 4 hours from home. So I didn't travel home. In the UK, to go more than half an hour, 1 hour somewhere is a very long distance. So in contrast to, for example, my wife is Brazilian, in contrast to Brazil, where they really encourage you to keep the family close and to be able to catch up every week, that's not a culture we have. So I used to see my parents on holidays, which is the end of every semester, a very different experience. And then I specialized later on in a master's after my geography degree. I specialized in land and water management and irrigation, specifically because I wanted to go overseas. Prior to university, I'd done voluntary work. As a youngster, I spent a lot of time outside, camping, canoeing, outdoor activities with the Scouts. And with a group of these Scouts, we organized and trained ourselves to be surveyors, to install water supplies, to deal with sanitation, to be builders also. In Kenya, we implemented a water supply project in Kenya before I went to university. So when I was going through my first degree, I was looking to go abroad. And my second degree focused on irrigation, so I had to go to the tropics. That was the primary reason.
Wow.
Without even thinking about where I would be going or what job I'd be getting, it was just the kind of intent that drove me forward. So I headed out to Malaysia, and I worked as like an intern with Unilever on plantations in Malaysia. I was in the development division. My direct line manager was 6, so I ended up directly supervising around 200 men at the age of 23. And that gave me a huge amount of experience in management and structure, logistics and organization. It was an 80 square kilometer oil palm plantation. I was responsible for development. So that's the road, the water supplies, and most importantly, I was the irrigation and drainage specialist. So all the irrigation and drainage for the plantation, replanting all the trees, etc.
So what a kind of different challenges in just a a short time of your life at the beginning of your career. How it sounds for you, look back and say, wow, I do it again, or I do it better, or I do it differently, or it was exactly what I expected from that.
I don't think anybody knows what to expect. In fact, when I was told by the chairman of plantation group that I'd be going out to a plantation he had worked on as a youngster, I thought I was going to Africa. I never imagined I was going to Borneo. I went up to Malaysia, in East Malaysia, in North Borneo, and I went scuba diving up there. Lots of first experiences. The first time I came across armed groups, we had pirates coming off the Sulu Sea who were trying to steal the payroll for the plantations, because the plantation had 8,000 employees. I was in charge of 200, but there were 8,000. So you can imagine you have to have the helicopter come in with the money. We disperse straight away with armed police, get it back to our own men to pay them. And I experienced the first experience of seeing a village devastated by gunfire from these pirates. I know it sounds strange to use the word pirates in this century, but they come by boat.
So better word to quantify what they were doing.
Correct. So as experiences, it was huge. But, it really set the scene for later life working abroad. But at the same time, you start to experience those highs and those lows. Highs of success and really achieving things, and lows of loneliness and being alone. You're being in a situation where you don't have any of the modern conveniences of home.
And how was your interaction with the local country and local culture at that beginning? What made the more difference for you that you can remember and you can share with us?
It's a very interesting question. We, as a young man of 23, living out in a plantation which you have to get to by aeroplane or boat, there are no roads to get there. You're surrounded by the plantation, surrounded by the jungle, rainforest, secondary rainforest. The only other foreigners on the plantation was the general manager and his wife. She was English, he was from New Zealand. So all my interactions were with Malaysians. All my staff were Malaysians. I spent my day with Malaysians. So you very quickly learn to just appreciate and learn from their daily life. You get into a routine. As you get older, you realize that curiosity, that interest is actually key to just enjoying the place. Otherwise, you get very frustrated because you don't have everything you'd expect from home. But yeah, that's quite a challenge.
You were saying that, and I figured out that most of British people that I met in my international career, they said that it's very common for the British live abroad. Their expectations or their ambitions were first learn as much as possible and live a big adventure at the beginning of their career. Do you agree? What do you think about that beliefs that we listen from others about the culture, the British culture of be like open to a life abroad?
I think you'll find this in a lot of European countries, especially the UK and France. It's common. You've met lots of family members who have been abroad, or you've heard of lots of people who have been abroad, and it's not unusual for the middle class to have experienced that. Then you have the legacy from World War II and from the colonies, where many people have been abroad to either your uncle was abroad fighting in the army, or my grandfather was in the merchant navy, he was out in Singapore. So you actually want to go and experience and see those things because you've heard about it when you're younger. So it's not that uncommon. And because the families are pushing you to be independent, and they're not trying to hold you back, they don't want, well, hold you back is the wrong phrase. They don't, strengthening the family unit by keeping people close is not the objective. The objective is for everybody to flourish. And so, yeah, it's a very different culture to Brazilian culture, but there's definitely that strong interest, and you learn about it at a young age. Whether they're engineers, work in oil, work in medicine, there's always opportunities in Hong Kong, in the Middle East, in Dubai. There's all sorts of new opportunities today in different parts of the world.
So deal with something that is for some rich countries, like, do that. It's impossible. It's the challenge for those countries. without resources, without knowledge, without a lot of material that we have. You have to build from your creativity. You have to use your ingenuity to build on those critical places and be your best.
Yeah, working abroad is a lot more challenging because you're given a lot more responsibility. But that's also a lot of the fun of it. You're trusted with decisions that you would never be trusted to back home.
Okay.
You're managing large numbers of people you'd never manage at that age back home, like at 23. After I did that 1 year with Unilever, in Malaysia on oil palm plantations, I wanted to work abroad, but finding work abroad is very difficult. So I actually came back to the UK and I would do a job. I'd run a bar, I'd run a restaurant, and I'd be running these for maybe 6 months or 9 months, 12 months before I got another contract. And I would pick up a consulting contract or a short-term contract overseas. And then after that 1 year contract or 3-month contract finished, came back. So for example, I worked for Mott McDonald's, an engineering consulting company in Oman, looking at a water assessment. I actually went back to work in Oman later for the government as supporting a national well inventory. But another job I, for example, did, I went out to Qatar working for an Egyptian company that was providing irrigation and architectural advice. And I headed up the irrigation section. So they're very unusual jobs, but those are the little jobs I had to do to get the experience so I could then go abroad properly later. Obviously, I hadn't planned any of this. It was more a question of what you need to do to get to where you want to be. And my objective was to work abroad, and my experience was now in irrigation and water supply. So very limited. But over time, I discovered it was my management experience that was most useful. And then it was my management experience that really helped me get the jobs later and enabled me to really flourish and do well.
You mentioned about your basis, your educational basis, and of course the practice is very important. And we always have people talking about the conflict, about the theory and the practical. How the formal education helped you to build that good environment and put a better conscience about dealing with ambiguity and negotiate under tough circumstances like you mentioned right now.
Right. So I was very fortunate. You're right. The formal education you get can be extremely useful. A lot of it doesn't seem like that at the time. But for example, when later on I was working in Holland for an NGO focused on water supplies and sanitation. And it was my experience there working with that enabled me, and they encouraged me to study an MBA in the UK. They even paid me quarter salary throughout the 1 year period of the MBA. So this was key to a lot of my formal education in management after having got experience. But as you point out, it was actually my formal education, irrigation, land and water management, that gave me my first jobs. So I would break it into a few areas. I think first of all, there's technical expertise that you really need when you start out. You've got to bring something to the table. Clearly, you're not a manager yet. You haven't supervised a team. Maybe you could supervise a person. So the technical expertise will get you into those roles. Management, project management qualifications, and I would support anybody to study project management, are critical, because knowing how to really, particularly the tools for managing projects, the Gantt chart, these types of tools make a huge difference once you hit the ground and you've got to do practical implementation. But the MBA really elevated my comprehension and understanding of a whole host of areas. From financing, the distinction between profit and cost-based centers. How you manage a cost-based center is never taught in an MBA. It only focuses on profit. But in the United Nations and in other organizations, a lot of the work is about getting money and spending your budget to the fullest. Then you have metrics. The private sector is very good at measuring success because they measure it through profit. They may not necessarily measure it through quality of service, but they measure through profit. In the United Nations or in a non-profit making organization, you have to create the KPIs, key performance indicators. You've got to decide what are the measures of success, and then you have to prove you're reaching those. A lot of people fail to do that. And that's one reason why a lot of organizations are not good at delivering in those contexts. And those that are very good at measurement. So data measurement is still critical. Marketing is another critical tool. Marketing, strategic marketing. So the design of a product and how you design a product to meet needs. In the commercial world, that's in order to make a product you can sell to a target audience. In the public sector, strategic marketing is how you design a service or a product to meet the needs of people who probably are facing a whole range of challenges. But it doesn't negate the value of it. You still have to measure. You still have to understand and comprehend the details. You still got to design a product that can be delivered and have access, suits those clients in order to serve them best. So there's a lot of nuances which are really powerful. And that's why I would argue that formal training, particularly as an MBA, is especially powerful. There's a big difference to my performance and the performance of people, for example, who'd studied managing public organizations. They didn't measure success in the way I did.
Okay.
I was fortunate to win a scholarship to study an MBA in Cambridge when I was working for an NGO in Holland. This was really interesting because I'd worked in the UN before in Afghanistan, and I had the opportunity to now really level up my skill sets in the private sector. And the similarity of issues faced by companies and the public sector are much more than people realize. Management is largely the same. People, their skills, how you motivate. Measuring success is entirely different. Profit-based centers and cost-based centers are completely different in terms of how you measure success. So whereas in a profit-based center, you can simply use money and your EBITDA, or earnings before interest, tax, depreciation, and amortization, in the public sector, you really have to define those metrics yourself. The key performance indicators, the measures of success. And then you have a budget to spend, so you've got to prove that you're achieving your objectives in expending that budget. The sad thing in cost centers is that spending the budget is often the priority, not the achievements you have to hit. But I found myself often achieving way beyond others who had trained formally in management, say public sector management, because I was focused much more on the measures of success and less on the finances and the budget expenditure. Strategic marketing is a critical area, which I think is completely underrated in the public sector. The private sector, obviously, they look at product development, product design, how you can meet the needs of clients or a target market. In the public sector, it's actually exactly the same thing, but they don't realize it. You need to design a service, whatever that service is, in order to meet the needs, however difficult those needs are, of the target audience, and then provide it to them in a way they can easily access it and gain the most from it. So it's exactly the same process, but because there's no profit involved, people don't realize that's what they're doing. And I think there's often a misnomer in the public sector that just having people at a desk and providing a service is sufficient. In the private sector, you would be monitoring the client interface, the quality of customer support. Is that being done properly in all the public sector organizations in your experience? I'm not so sure. So there's a long way it could go. But this is the kind of thing I was applying through the United Nations in different countries.
But very interesting.
Before we go on, it might be worth me commenting on what is the primary role of the UN. The United Nations in most countries is not delivering humanitarian assistance. It's not delivering the dramatic things you experience on television. I've been involved in those, but that's logistics and it's humanitarian context. Most of the UN work is about helping countries improve the quality of their laws to meet international standards, for example, for human rights, or it could be for construction, or it could be for schooling, or international standards for prisons. So the United Nations job is to help countries meet those higher quality standards. And therefore you work with them day in, day out to change their policy, to improve their policy. You work with the ministers, with the civil servants, and then you get Parliament to push for change. So if the government doesn't want to change, you have to work with the opposition as well. And then when you're talking about the standards, very often you're working with the private sector because they're implementing many of these projects for government. So you have to get the private sector to meet the standards. And very often international companies are happy to do that, but they're not being paid sufficient in order to meet those standards. So you understand it's a strange kind of circular environment that we work in. Also, of course, with charities, helping with shelters or other support mechanisms, helping with the poverty trap. And the government needs all these partners to deliver. But then all of these partners, including government ministries, have to work to a higher quality standard than they have historically. And that's our job. We need to continuously encourage, beat them, support them. It's a tough process.
It's quite important we understand that it's not a volunteer job. Like, I'll go there to be a saint and to do something that is good for me. No, it's a serious job with a lot of long-term impacts for a population. You have to build those metrics and have that deep in terms of bring that experience from the formal education and adapt the metrics from private sector to public sector is something very, very, very difficult for most of the governments adapt that, and they unfortunately most of them have never realized how important it is to bring that experience and the metrics to put a value of that job is not only something that bring votes, but bring much more than this, and they are not accounting all those things in their projects.
It's a really rewarding and very interesting job. As the head of a UN, first of all, because there are so many different standards in the world, from agriculture through to transportation, you have many different UN agencies. There's well over 40 UN agencies. WHO obviously focuses on health. UNICEF focuses on children's education and other aspects. So this is not surprising. And then each of them is working in crisis scenarios as well as long-term development scenarios. But as the head of a UN agency working in a country, you are representative to that country. It's a diplomatic position. But you also are managing the relationship with the government. You're helping ensure quality projects are designed. You're building the partnerships. But you have to raise the funds for those projects to be implemented from different member states. We have 193 member states. But for example, I might be trying to raise funds from the US and from Sweden, as well as others, for a specific project and talk to their ambassadors. Then you're responsible for managing the budget of the office, for the human resources of the office, for the logistics, for the administration. Of course, you have staff underneath you, but the responsibility sits with you as head and diplomat in charge of that office. So it's a very functional job. You're not remote from the detail. And that makes it really, really a privilege. You can also imagine when a crisis hits a country like COVID, as the United Nations, we have to be there and we have to help ensure the government can perform to the highest standards to support its population, even when the government ministries are shutting down because they don't know what to do and they're scared. And then we would have to adjust and support WHO's work with the Ministry of Health, regardless, because that becomes the priority with COVID. So, it's a fascinating work. It really is. And I'd encourage anybody who wants a challenge and adventure, a lot of work on partnerships overseas to do this kind of work. It's just incredibly challenging.
So you are talking, and I'm seeing that there are a lot of myths and false affirmatives about the subject of working abroad. How is the logic and rationale used to deal with all those myths and find the truth behind those bias?
Well, that's a big question. I think first of all, I'd say you suggested just a bit of structure to this. Mm-hmm. In terms of myths, I would say the first thing is that it's generally assumed that expatriates earn a lot of money, have a high quality of life, and can jet set around the world. It is true, we have a high quality of life, but it also comes with extremely high costs. Whether your costs are covered by your company or organization is a real issue. Do they cover housing costs? Do they cover schooling costs? Because those would be a lot more than back home. And you have to remember that you're traveling all the time. If you take vacation, you've got family. If you're married, you've got family in two countries. Mm-hmm. Your kids when they leave school, may go to universities in other countries. You're traveling for medical care because the country you're in may not have good hospitals. Is that covered by your contract? So there are a lot of challenges, but I do think that the the overall issue is that this myth of money and high quality of life, it is a high quality of life, but not because you're relatively comfortable. It's because you're always dealing with such interesting issues and you have much more stimulation than if I'd stayed back home in London. I know London's an amazing place, but at the same time, you've got commuting every day, you've got all these other challenges. Sure, if you're working abroad, you may have a few positives. The company will probably provide a driver because they can't afford to have you having a problem in the country. Yeah. They will help you with health insurance, with pension, obviously. You are much more responsible for what you're dealing with. And I think it's really important that people don't forget the level of responsibility you may have. In terms of learnings, I would say that managing an overseas career is not as difficult as people think it would be, because once you start working abroad, you become familiar with it. So networking is critical. And your network of colleagues, of experiences will be with other people who are also international. So you're no longer thinking of people you can meet, but your networking is people who you'll meet at a conference or you'll touch, but they know they need that network too. So networking is really a big thing that you have to focus on, more than in your own country because you're all moving.
Yes.
But at the same time, you all have more time for each other and you develop friendships will last your life. Everybody is facing family needs when family is distant. Everybody is dealing with the same kind of issue. So I would argue that's in my think more of a learning than a positive or a negative. I would argue that the huge range of experiences you get and the responsibility you get is a massive positive. It's quite rare that you have so many different extreme things to deal with, and that's because of the nature of your relationships. If you're dealing with a minister or the cabinet of a prime minister or president on one day, and then you're in a village 2 days later with your staff showing you a charitable and NGO project, that's not unusual. And you could be talking at a conference. So managing time becomes critical, but you have these very different juxtapositions of experience on a continuous basis. That makes life very rewarding if you enjoy it. I mean, if you want static, fine. I like change. So I'd say that was a key point. Challenges. There's no question that it takes a huge toll on personal and family life. That's probably the biggest negative, is that you really have to work with your partner on how to make sure you spend time together, you are able to be together, you're able to enjoy things. And it becomes all the more challenging because the children are changing schools, they're losing friends. They may thrive in one environment, in one country, in one culture, and they may find another one very difficult. They may go to an international school that's American in one country, and in another country it could be a British system, it could be a French system. Normally you have Anglo-Saxon and French systems around the world, but typically more American than British these days. So that
it's something, but that we don't think about it. That is, expatriate is fantastic, but expatriate in one country for 5 years, for 10 years in the same country is fantastic. But have short assignments like 2 years in one place, one year in one place, 6 months in one place, over and over and over again, it destroy for sure some personal life, and you have to manage that very close and with a partnership with your family very strong in terms to don't ruin your life forever.
And if you're working in more difficult environments where the family can't join you, then it becomes even more challenging. And particularly because you experience highs and lows, but not much in the middle. So, for example, you have successes at work, you're able to achieve things are moving forward, but you're feeling lonely, you're having a tough time. You might have a very, very difficult weekend. So you have highs and lows and much less mediocre, because you have to remember that in a more difficult environment, there's much less to do. If you're in a capital city, it's entirely different to being in a rural area of most countries. You may be able to drive out to a river to go for a swim and have a barbecue on the river, but you're on your own. So, where's the fun? You get the drift. And I think one of the other points that you raised earlier was this point about understanding of where you are. And there is a real risk of making a lot of assumptions. I've talked about marketing quite a bit, because if you want to understand your market, you have to measure it. You've got to have data. You need to understand what you're dealing with. In a foreign country, you can't take anything for granted. So when you're looking at that country, you've got to assume you really don't know anything. So a lot of questioning or ground truthing, talking to people, a lot of surveys, understanding details so that you can really understand the specific value chain of the market you're looking at or the specific logistics of that region you're trying to look at. Most people have heard of the example of Coca-Cola. Wherever you go in the world, you can find Coca-Cola bottles. Why is that? It's quite simple. Very early on, they resolved the logistics chain for Coca-Cola and they got it everywhere. People on motorbikes, on bicycles, had panniers or bags that they could take this Coca-Cola out to little shops in the middle of nowhere. Now imagine you're trying to do that with healthcare, or you're trying to provide that supervision with, getting fuel transported out to different locations. Very different challenge. But these are the kinds of challenge that really are very rewarding if you've got to solve them. You have to understand the environment, get to know the context, and then design solutions for your product, whether that's a government service or whether that's a commercial product.
Behind the government, as you mentioned, you have the right people that you have to access to solve that specific problem or issue. So the network and be the friend that have a friend, that have another friend that can introduce to you to solve that problem is key for that challenge.
Partnerships are always the key in contexts you're not familiar with. You have to partner in everything, but it works.
Yeah.
People always want to solve a problem.
Your life and the life of your institution in terms of a brand depend on that. No? Yeah,
absolutely.
Well, a lot of people that come to you and have a lot of questions about your professional life and how it works, expatriate worker, what you have to take care, what do you have to prepare for, what really matters in that expatriate career according to your experience, what you can share in terms of more important.
I think, to be honest, it's different by every person, but what I would say is that if you're going to be working abroad, you really need to be driven by or take pleasure in new experiences, preferably in different people or cultures, but that's less important. Much more important is you've got maybe adventure, but most important is you've got to enjoy change, surprises, and anything that comes up that's different, because it will all the time. And if that type of thing interests you, then drives you, then you don't get frustrated. You don't complain that it's not like where I came from, or it's not like something else I've experienced. We're here in Portugal, and in Portugal, I love it here, but there's many frustrating things about the way the Portuguese do so many things. It's so slow, etc. I'm glad to be here. I'd be in Germany if I wanted things to be fast and efficient, but I'm comfortable with things to be a bit like this, so I have to take my time and enjoy it. And I think that's the case in most foreign environments. You've got to expect to be surprised and then just go with the flow as much as you can. I think one thing I would comment though, less developed countries where change, which may be further behind in development, change is typically much faster, also more random or erratic. So you have to be ready to move with those extremes, with that short-term change. And that can be difficult depending on the companies you work for, the jobs, but it's a huge opportunity. And the reason why the opportunity is there is because things are moving quickly. So someone who can adapt quickly to that changing value chain or opportunities or market shift obviously has a lot to gain. I suppose the one thing I would add a link to that is the point that always understand your population. Demographics are everything. Most countries are 50%, most developing countries, 50% of the people are under the age of 15. So you really need to understand your population however you're trying to work.
And the difference in that demographic, because as you mentioned, in some countries that you had experience, you have a variance in terms of age, in terms of social classes, in terms of access to goods.
Huge change, yes.
So it's a big change and the variables you can't control in those situations. Not
in most developing countries, 50% of the population lives in the capital city.
Yeah.
But then you have to remember that the capital city is a very small central business district surrounded by large suburban areas. And only one of those small suburban areas, or maybe a scattering, are very wealthy. Wealthy families are very few and far between. In many countries, maybe 20 families run the country. They control the politics. They control the businesses. They influence and control maybe many elements of the criminal areas too. So understanding your environment is absolutely critical. Yeah.
How difficult is to be neutral in stressed situations in a foreign country like that, where you are seeing so different environments like that you described it right now, and become neutral to execute your jobs to make the things happen?
It's an interesting, one of the reasons I struggle with the question is that neutrality assumes that your personal opinion matters, that how you feel about it is important. Your objective is clear. If you know what you're trying to achieve, and coming from the United Nations angle, that becomes quite clear. It's about human rights ultimately, and everything that improves the situation for a citizen, then neutrality is much easier, because you may know a lot about the person sitting across from. He could be thoroughly corrupt. He may have been involved in different criminal endeavors. You may be well aware that he was involved in a civil war or massacring people. You come across this, but his personality and him as an individual is irrelevant. You're trying to get to a bigger prize, and your feelings don't matter. So you've got to put those to one side, and you have to focus on what is the end goal. What are you really trying to achieve, and how do you get there? If this individual in front of me, male or female, is the best way to influence the civil servants who are going to implement the service, or the best way to ensure that non-governmental organizations have access to parts of the country which has faced an earthquake, for example, now in Myanmar, you sit down and you deal with them, because that's the only way to get a solution. So you have to suspend your opinion, judgments. These things don't matter. They're personal feelings. The situation in Myanmar right now is exactly that. All of the aid going into the earthquake zone is being controlled and taken off the hands of NGOs and organizations by military soldiers. I'm sure they are using it and then passing on what they want to the people they want to support. But you don't have a choice. You've got to work with the powers that be in order to reach the end goal.
Do you believe that kind of skill is something that a professional in that situation can develop and learn fast, or it's something that is natural from the professional?
I honestly believe that any professional can develop that skill. The challenge is whether you want to let your emotions control you, or whether you want to let your professional work control you. And the truth is that if it's a private company, you're trying to negotiate a contract, you will hold judgment on that person you're dealing with in order to get the contract. You may have stories and rumors about the individual, but the business for your company is important and the individual doesn't matter. I hate to be crude, but it's exactly the same when it comes to, in fact, it's probably even more the case when you come to life-saving issues. So, yeah.
Well, let's talk a little bit about some soft topics to relax a little bit more. What means being a retired expatriate as you are living here? And what means, according to your experience, be retired in those countries? Because you mentioned sometime that for them, there are some drivers that are different for them in terms of retirement, like family. And for us, family also is important, but we have another drivers that we put more value than others. So how is going to be an expatriate retired after this active and long life in different countries?
I mean, I would argue that people pretty much have the same drivers everywhere you go, which is why marketing could be so successful.
Yeah.
But I mean, my needs, your needs, the needs of people in quite poor places are all pretty much the same. We want to be comfortable. We want to look after our family. We want to have enough money for a comfortable life. Some people really want to be uber rich, but the majority of us want to have enough to be comfortable, a regular income. We want to have health insurance, etc., and of course a pension. So when it comes to retiring, every individual is different, and obviously we'll identify the environments which we feel provide us with what we're looking for. I would say that retiring to a country you don't know at all is something I can't imagine. That would be really messy, difficult, adapting to a culture you don't know. So we nearly always retire to places that we have some familiarity, and we're not making our life more complicated. But of course, coming to Portugal, you discover that government systems are not the fastest, that they do have a huge backlog from so many thousands of immigrants. I don't have any contacts here. So again, getting to know people, creating your network, figuring out how things work is key. It's all new experiences. And as I said before, if you enjoy change, if you don't mind new experiences, and when you have time and you're retired, you can take your time, then you can kind of laugh a bit when someone's being ridiculous because you've seen this 1,000 times in your life.
Mm-hmm.
This little administrator in a health center getting upset with me doesn't really matter. I just have to find someone else. I have the time to deal with it. So I think a lot of it is about your attitude to moving into retirement and how you organize and plan it. So you enjoy those new experiences. You don't get frustrated. The mindset is everything. Difference isn't ugly. Difference is just different.
Do you miss the changing?
I do miss the dynamism of always dealing with new issues. And what I have to say is, I worked for the UN for 20 years. Every job was completely different. The only time I did 2 jobs that were the same was when I changed country. And when you change country, everything changes. The politics is different. Everything is upside down. So the objectives were the same, global objectives, but the way to implement was completely different. So yeah, I've got so used to things being always different and new that's probably something that I do lack or miss these days. But to be honest, I really enjoy exercising. Being strong in older age is critical. And I've got a bad leg, so I really want to focus on that. Being healthy, physically and mentally fit. That's why your podcast is so good, because that keeps you mentally challenged. Yeah, all of these things are important parts of quality of life.
You mentioned one part when we drank some beers about one thing that you saw in one country specifically about put generations to live together and to contribute for both. Do you think that kind of contact of older people with young people can contribute more to build an environment with more with a better quality of life for the older people, and bring those younger people to realize that situation and that new world that we are living today in terms of more aged people than younger people, and how to deal with that situation.
Right. Yeah, I came across this experience in the Western Balkans, so particularly in Albania and Bosnia, where they were looking at how they could support the elderly. And in many of the former socialist countries like that, they have multi-use centers for older people. So the village will have a hall where older people can get a cup of tea or coffee and a snack. And it serves the purpose of keeping them in touch with support, but also making sure they meet each other. And as we looked at this, we found my colleague was finding examples from other parts of the world where they had kind of implemented nurseries alongside multi-use centers for older people. And the whole idea was that the older people could literally go spend some time in the nursery with the kids, and when they were tired after an hour or two, go back and rest. But simultaneously, the younger children who may have less exposure to grandparents at home in a modern environment, were having this opportunity to be lovingly looked after and enjoy playing with older people. I mean, I think it's a fantastic approach. I wish we'd see more of it. Probably we also need to see more of the teenagers learning from the older people, but they won't have time for that. But I understand that this approach was being looked at in, I forget which African country it was, but also I understand it's being looked at in Finland. I don't know how far they got with it. It's something I really need to follow up on.
Well, as you mentioned, that's a specific case I'm curious about. Do you have more anecdotal cases of your career as unexpected that you could share with us in terms of that kind of stress situations or classical marketing cases, as you mentioned?
Well, I have a couple of, as you know, I've got a couple of examples. The first one, I'm going to refer to my notes if you don't mind. The most positive kind of work experience of my life was actually when I went out to Afghanistan. I actually worked there 3 occasions, and this was the 3rd time around. And it was as the Taliban had fallen the first time, and a new government had moved in, and they were struggling with a range of things. I went out to run a technology project to build information management capacity government in government. In practice, we focused on GIS or digital mapping and databases, because if we could get the two of those to work, then many government services could operate. So that was at the core of the approach we took. We developed essentially a back office, which was developing products, and a front office. So this is classic private sector approach. A front office, which was selling those products to non-government people, like UN agencies, the private sector, charities, but providing it free to government. And that includes specific maps, which they could then use for their work. It also includes databases of information, and we're trying to adopt international standards like ISIC, the Industrial Standard Classification Codes, so that you could use it for structuring information in government and then sharing information. Frankly, this was incredibly successful. We used the money we took because the UN is not used to taking money. We don't sell things. So we had to get rid of the money we took. So as we took money, we were using it to train people, training them in digital mapping, in databases, and in more general IT. Word, Excel, all the Microsoft certification. We ended up training thousands of people, 2,500 people. Even when I went to work in Sudan later, Afghans were coming across and finding me. They're working in South Sudan, and came up and showed me their certification from AIMS, Afghanistan Information Management Service, because they knew that I had been there and I had set that element up. So that was really rewarding, but it also meant that for the first time, Afghanistan was using as they started to use computerized systems, they had standards for sharing information, and the databases were interactive. So we really helped develop the first skills that were developed, used across the government. Fantastic, huge, probably still the most successful work I ever did in my life. Had such a big impact. It was only a short time as well, as like a year and a half. But very often it is that short impact work that has the biggest, the surprising impact you don't expect.
Fantastic. And I remember now one program from United Nations, He for She.
Yeah.
Did you have an experience with that program?
The He for She was a UN Women. UN Women is focused on women's rights and gender equality. He for She was a global campaign focused on encouraging men to stand up for women's rights and gender equality. We adapted that to Albania. It's a really low budget project. We managed to get sponsorship from Vodafone, and then the campaign was really focused on getting men to talk to women about this issue of gender equality, but we did it through football. Albanians are football obsessed. And in the end, the design was a classic private sector approach to marketing, where we had advertising online. We had an application you download to the phone. The application was a competition, and the competition ran during a live football game. And there was also one that just ran weekly, but the primary competition ran during a live football game, and then we'd run them at different stadiums across the country. As everybody arrived at the stadium, we had little tents outside, all branded, staff branded, or NGO staff branded, men and women, and they would be encouraging the girls to bring their boyfriends across to talk about the subject and download the app. Then they would go into the stadium, and during the game, they would get alerts that there was a question. And when they were alerted, they had to answer a question: who was going to score the next goal? What time of the game would be the first corner? All sorts of things linked to the game. But between those questions was a little bit of information about gender equality, a little fact about, for example, the fact that 12 women were killed every summer in Albania when the families were at the beach, or something like this, which is quite a sad fact, of course.
Okay.
But the point is that we were educating the men by them playing this game, and then they would win. The winner of the competition at the end of the game would, at the very end of that game, go up to the center of the pitch, a small stage, a celebrity or a football player would award them with a smartphone. And this was so successful, we had, the population of the country is 3.2 million people. We had there's around 4.7 million viewings of the adverts that we were putting out.
Okay.
And we had over 1.5 million downloads of the application, which was just unheard of. So it's a typical private sector approach, but to a public sector problem. And this was we got it onto football shows, onto the news. We used to we had a branded car that we would take down to the beach, so you could have like a photo shoot with the right information and all these types of small things that really worked.
So the secret formula of any success case is keep it simple as possible.
Yeah. People have basic drivers. So you keep it simple, you focus on what you're really trying to achieve, cut out all the fluff. It's not normal for the UN to work with the private sector to develop an application, to launch them. But if you do normal, you don't change. So if you want to advance things, you have to think out of the box.
Bring that people is also a success case because that relationship and that link, that and connection that United Nations and the professionals who are trained for that is brilliant, because everything is proven that it doesn't work alone.
No.
You need to connect all those pieces to make the whole engine works well.
Right.
Well, we are coming to our last questions, and one of the best I put at the end. How do you think it's possible motivate and engage new generations to pay more attention to what's real life, rather than virtual, digital only? Because all the startups, all the new industry, we are talking about the digital life, and we forget that we have a real life to live and to build and to develop nowadays. The other one is a tool, as you mentioned, but it's a tool that works, but we have to apply and solve the crises and solve the problems by using them without abandon totally the relationship, the network. How can we engage and motivate and train that new generation?
I think the first thing is that you and I are not qualified to advise the next generation on how to deal with all this technology and manage it. Obviously, being physically and mentally fit is critical to everything. You need to have a social life. You have to have relationships. How you ensure people are more engaged in that physically than virtually, I don't know. I'm assuming that these younger generations is going to mix the physical and the virtual much more than we ever did.
Yes.
And I know that commentators say that gaming, where boys interact online at the same time as gaming, is better than viewing social media separately in your different bedrooms and then writing on text on phones. I'm not qualified to really give a lot of advice on that. What I would say is that I lost my place. What I would say is that the challenge for us is really, or the challenge to the youngsters is really how, following this experience online where things have moved into social media and other things for your personal life, and thanks to COVID it's accelerated the move into the virtual world from the work life, I would argue that we just have to start taking every opportunity to try and get physical interaction again. Offices must open up a few days a week, or they must insist staff meet each other for their own good, frankly. They'll learn more by networking physically than they will by networking virtually. However, the older generations have always mistrusted the youth. They've always mistrusted media. My parents used to think television was terrible for us. Trust me, we watched a lot of television. I don't think it did me any harm. So I think the bigger issue is that the older generations need to trust the youngsters to figure it out. We had to figure it out, they will figure it out, and I've got no doubt that their kids are going to figure out the next challenge. Obviously, things are accelerating very fast now. AI is possibly it's a mixture of most over and underrated technology there is, because right now it's already all over the place. We can use it and we underrate how useful that is. But at the same time, we over exaggerate the threat, in my opinion, that it brings, because we historically have not really ever found a technology to drive us backwards. I don't think that AI is going to turn us all into zombies sitting on seats, like in the WALL-E movie in the spaceship where they don't get off their butts. So I think the youngsters will figure it out.
I'm excited about this new century, because we need to find the balance, and that's a challenge on how to balance again the overexposure in one tool and bring back the things that real matter for most of us human beings.
Like I say, I like change. So I don't have a problem with it. I think it's more a question of everybody adapting to it, and most people are very uncomfortable with change.
Well, Dave, what are you learning, reading? How you keep your mind working at this moment here in Portugal? How you update your news? We talk about media, So how the information are coming to you right now? What do you recommend for our audience?
Okay, well, first of all, I'd say I read The Economist every week, and I don't read 100% of it, but there's always a lot of interesting information from there around the world. But I think what is really where there's my greatest excitement with information access is podcasts, ironically. I don't watch the YouTube ones typically, it's all audio, but I follow a lot of history podcasts because I feel very much if we don't understand our past, we don't really understand the present, and we can't help shape the future. The rest is classified, is historical, less historical. It's basically looks at past operations of subterfuge or spying, for example, by the CIA. How did they overthrow the Shah, etc., in Iran? So that's a really interesting podcast to listen to. Conflicted is one that few people probably would listen to, but it's focused on contemporary politics and history, often in far-flung parts of the world, especially the Muslim world. For example, I'm currently listening to a series about Ethiopia. From the very origins of Ethiopia, the Jews, the Christians, Muhammad, and the year of the elephant, right through to modern day Ethiopia. And it's really fascinating. Then there's another one called, I listened to quite a lot, called The Empire. Now this is really a nerdy history program by the British Empire. But right now, season 16 focuses on the history of Ireland as a British colony from the earliest days of colonization to today. Because, of course, Ireland was the only white colony, European white colony, that the British had. And it was used, the experience there was used as a template to colonize the rest of the world, the British Empire. And then in terms of politics, the one I would really recommend is the Ezra Klein show. He's an American podcast published by New York Times.
Okay.
But it's very thoughtful, typically left-of-center approach to US social issues and politics. But he's excellent. I really recommend that listen.
I took note of all of them, and I will put in our podcast and social media to share with the audience, because I believe that, as you mentioned, understand the past, something very important for us to build a better future for us, because the life is a cycle, and we can repeat the same mistakes if we don't know how to avoid them. So that's very, very interesting, those tips. And talking about tips, I would like your final words, advices, practical tips, personal lessons, what you want to leave for your legacy.
Well, that's a big ask. But I say for anybody who is considering work overseas, it's really rewarding. Go for it. Don't hesitate. I think if you're open to change, if you enjoy new ideas, new challenges, it'll give you experience you wouldn't get anywhere else. But network, wait for the opportunities, and then seize that opportunity with both hands. For those of us who are retired, I think it's the basics. You keep physically, mentally, and socially fit and active. Time goes really fast, so enjoy every minute. Especially with family. But for example, I continue to want to try out new things. I want to live in a country where I have a high quality of life, not where I'm frustrated. So I kind of have this people who know me would say I'm not the most relaxed person, but I do have a pretty relaxed approach to living here. Apart from that, I think enjoy change, enjoy the future.
Well, thank you, Dave. Aproveite o tempo que você tem. Tábula Rasa Sênior volta em breve com vocês. Muito obrigado pela audiência. E, David, muito obrigado pela sua generosidade em falar aqui conosco hoje.
Tá bom.
Até a próxima.
Até a próxima.
Você ouviu Tábula Rasa com Felipe Ferreira. Acesse tabularasasenior.com.br para ouvir todos os episódios e ter acesso a muito mais conteúdo. E nos siga nas redes sociais. O Tábula Rasa é produzido pela Radiofobia Podcast e Multimídia. Esperamos você no próximo episódio.